In the violent heart of the Viking Age, among the roaring longships and bloodied battlefields, there walked warriors unlike any other. These were not just men, they were monsters wrapped in flesh. Their eyes wild, their bodies bare of armor, they rushed headlong into enemy lines with a fury that terrified even their own kin. They were called Berserkers. Their name alone carried dread. The word survives in our modern language as going berserk, a term for losing control, going mad with rage. But to the Vikings this was no mere metaphor. Berserkers were believed to be truly consumed by primal force, transformed into something beyond human. These warriors stood apart from ordinary fighters. While most shield-bearers wore chainmail and fought in disciplined formations, berserkers abandoned such constraints. They tore off their armor, howled like wolves and bit into their own shields. Covered in bear or wolf skins, sometimes completely naked, they charged into battle with no regard for their own safety. Arrows that struck them were said to bounce off. Blades that slashed them left no wound. Whether these were exaggerations or not, the impact they had on Viking warfare is undeniable. They were the living embodiment of chaos. The sagas are filled with stories of berserkers. In the poem Hrafnsmal, they are described as men who howled like beasts, foamed at the mouth and bit their shields. In the Ynglinga saga, Snorri Sturluson writes that Odin's men went without armor, were as mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields and were strong as bears or bulls. They killed people and neither fire nor iron affected them. These descriptions paint a portrait not of a disciplined warrior, but of a possessed being, something inhuman. But who were they really? Were they born into berserkerhood, or did they undergo brutal training and rituals to become what they were? Historians continue to debate the nature of their transformation. Some argue that they were an elite cult of warriors chosen for their ferocity. Others suggest they were religious devotees, warrior priests in the service of Odin, the god of war, death, and frenzy. In either case, becoming a berserker was no accident. It required shedding the self and embracing a darker, more primal force. Odin, the All-Father, was not just a god of wisdom. He was the god of madness and ecstasy. He himself wandered the realms in disguise, sacrificing part of his humanity for power. In many stories, Odin's warriors mirrored his nature. Berserkers like Odin rejected normality. They existed on the edge, half human, half spirit. Their violence was not aimless, it was sacred. And this made them both revered and feared. What separated berserkers most from regular warriors wasn't just their behavior, it was the belief that they could not be harmed. Their battle state was called berserkganger, a trance or fury so intense that it shielded them from pain and fear. Some believed they were possessed by the spirits of animals. Others thought they were simply insane. Yet their enemies couldn't afford to wonder. They had to survive the onslaught. Not all berserkers were solitary maniacs. Some fought in bands, small, furious war groups that served kings and jarls. Their presence was both blessing and curse. A berserker could turn the tide of battle, slaughtering dozens in a single charge. But he could just as easily kill his allies if the frenzy took hold. The Icelandic law codes eventually mention bans against berserkers, suggesting that their behavior grew too dangerous even for the Vikings. Despite this, they held prestige. Some were bodyguards to kings. Others were mercenaries hired for impossible missions. The berserker was a tool of terror, sent ahead to shatter enemy morale. Imagine being a Saxon foot soldier holding your shield when a man painted in blood, eyes wide with madness, sprints toward you screaming. That fear alone may have won battles. Not all berserkers wore bear skins. There were also Ulfhednir, wolf-coated warriors. These were said to be even more wild, more animal than human. They were often associated with Odin's cult, perhaps forming the darker aspect of Norse military ritual. Where berserkers invoked the strength of the bear, Ulfhednir took on the cunning and cruelty of the wolf. They howled into battle, fought in packs, and refused to break formation even when wounded. It's important to remember that Viking warfare wasn't about numbers, it was about terror, speed, and surprise. Berserkers embodied all three. They were psychological weapons. Even if they weren't truly immune to pain, even if the stories were exaggerated, their effect was real. The myth was as dangerous as the man. But how much of this was legend and how much was truth? The line between myth and reality is blurry in the Viking world. Oral traditions were passed down for centuries before being written. Over time, tales of strong warriors may have morphed into stories of supernatural rage. And yet, archaeological findings suggest there may be more truth to the berserker myth than we imagine. Some graves have been uncovered with items linked to berserker imagery, animal skins, bones, and weapons etched with strange runes. In some burials, scholars found evidence of herbs, possibly used to induce altered states. This supports the theory that berserkers didn't rely solely on anger. They used substances, rituals, and spiritual belief to become something more. Socially, berserkers occupied a strange place. They were both honored and avoided. In peacetime they could be a liability. Known for violent tempers and uncontrollable rage, many were forced into exile or bound by law. Yet in war they were unleashed with full support. It's a paradox. The same society that feared them also celebrated them. The concept of the warrior in Norse culture was not just physical, it was spiritual. Dying in battle guaranteed entry to Valhalla, where fallen warriors would fight all day and feast all night. To die as a berserker was to die in the most honored way possible. Their role wasn't just military, it was mythic. They lived as legends before they even died. By the late Viking Age, however, things began to change. Christianity crept into the north. With it came new laws, new morality, and new fears. The wild, sacred fury of berserkers became dangerous in the eyes of the church. Their rites were seen as pagan blasphemy. Their animal skins became symbols of demonic possession. Slowly they were outlawed, executed, or simply erased from records. But their legend endured. To this day we speak of going berserk, of entering blind fury. We see them in video games, television, heavy metal songs, and tattoos. The berserker lives on, not as a historical figure alone but as a symbol. A symbol of the wild, uncontrolled power that sleeps in all of us. And maybe that's the key to their enduring power. Berserkers were not just ancient warriors, they were reflections of a part of the human psyche we try to hide. The part that craves violence, feels rage, and longs to break free from control. The berserker didn't repress this part. He embraced it, became it. And in doing so became more than a man, he became a monster, or perhaps, a god. In the chapters ahead, we will dive deeper into how these transformations took place. What did they ingest? What rituals did they perform? Could mushrooms really turn a man into a beast? Could chanting and pain really push a human mind beyond its limit? Or was it all illusion designed to terrify and manipulate? One thing is certain, the Viking berserker was more than just a fighter. He was a force of nature. And understanding him means staring directly into the darker corners of the Viking soul. There is a strange silence that settles just before the chaos of battle. The warriors stand in tense anticipation, clutching their axes, eyes fixed on the horizon. But somewhere in the Viking formation there's a different kind of stillness, a trembling, eerie kind. The berserkers are not preparing like the others. Their minds are not focused on strategy or commands. They are somewhere else, far beyond the mortal world. Some sway and mutter, others scratch their skin raw or claw at their faces. And then, just before the first war cries, they erupt. Screaming, howling, charging not as men but as beasts. What transformed them into such horrors? The answer may lie beneath the soil of Scandinavia, in the fragile caps of a fungus, the Amanita muscaria, better known as the fly agaric mushroom. These red and white mushrooms are iconic, bright, toxic-looking, almost whimsical in appearance. But their effects are anything but playful. Consumed in the right quantity, they induce vivid hallucinations, convulsions, distorted perception, extreme aggression, and a powerful loss of self. In the wrong dose they can kill. But in the right hands, or mouths, they can unlock something else entirely, a gateway to madness or perhaps to transformation. For years, scholars have speculated that Viking berserkers consumed these mushrooms in rituals before battle, using their effects to fuel their rage, dull their fear, and rip through the thin veil separating man from monster. The theory is compelling, and it's not just modern fantasy. Ethnobotanists have long documented the ritual use of Amanita muscaria among Siberian shamans, whose cultural roots are closely related to the ancient Norse. These shamans would dry the mushrooms, consume them, and enter trance states where they communicated with spirits, endured visions, and even performed acts of great strength or pain resistance. The parallels to berserker behavior are chillingly close. The tremors, the drooling, the twitching, all symptoms of fly agaric intoxication, match many of the descriptions found in Norse sagas. The shield biting, the wild screaming, the fearless charging into enemy lines with little regard for wounds, these could all be interpreted as the effects of psychedelic-induced frenzy. But did the berserkers actually do this? There's no definitive archaeological proof, no mushroom remains in graves, no ritual texts detailing a berserker brew. The Norse left behind few written records, and those that exist were penned centuries after the Viking Age ended. Yet oral traditions, sagas, and even early Christian accounts describe the berserkers' madness as being unnatural, like they were possessed or no longer human. That kind of transformation doesn't come from mere adrenaline. It hints at something deeper, more ritualistic. Something prepared. Something ingested. And mushrooms weren't the only suspects. Some historians point toward Hyoscyamus niger, henbane, as another candidate. Henbane is a powerful hallucinogen and narcotic, used throughout the ancient world to induce altered states, visions, and even violent rages. It grows naturally across Europe, including in Scandinavia, and was known to be used in magical and shamanic practices. In fact, henbane seeds have been discovered in Viking graves, clutched in pouches beside staffs and amulets. That's not coincidence, it's evidence. Whether smoked, brewed, or eaten, henbane could send a man spiraling into hallucinations and fury, numb to pain and utterly unhinged. If these substances were used, they weren't taken casually. Berserker rites were likely part of a strict ceremonial framework, led by experienced practitioners, possibly seeresses or war priests. The idea wasn't just to get high. It was to open the mind to a deeper force, perhaps Odin himself, or the animal spirit believed to live within. This wasn't about chemical escapism. This was spiritual possession. Before a raid or major battle, a berserker might fast or isolate himself, denying the body food and comfort to weaken the ego. Then came the chanting, slow, rhythmic, echoing like a drumbeat in the soul. Fires would blaze. Smoke would curl. The herbs or mushrooms, once dried or steeped in a special mixture, would be consumed. The mind would start to swim. Reality would bend. Time would stretch. And in that moment, somewhere between agony and awakening, the berserker would transform. In Norse mythology, the transformation from man to beast is a sacred act. Odin was the master shapeshifter. He could become an eagle, a serpent, or a wolf. For a warrior to become a bear or a wolf in battle was to follow the divine path of the god himself. This belief gave berserkers both spiritual permission and psychological power. They weren't just mimicking animals, they were becoming them. And when a man believes he is no longer a man, he stops fighting like one. Accounts from outside the Norse world also suggest this behavior. Enemies of the Vikings often described facing men who seemed utterly immune to pain. Men who fought until every bone was broken, whose wounds poured blood but who never slowed down. Was it true invincibility? No. But to a terrified enemy it might as well have been. A hallucinating, screaming warrior is more than just a threat, he's a symbol of death itself. But the effects of these rituals didn't end when the battle was over. The berserker gang, the frenzy, came with a terrible price. When the rage subsided, berserkers often collapsed, exhausted, trembling, or catatonic. Some wept. Some shook uncontrollably. Others fell into deep sleep for days. In some stories they turned on their own allies in confusion, unable to tell friend from foe. The transformation, once begun, could not always be easily reversed. That's why berserkers were both revered and feared, even by their own people. In peacetime, a berserker was often unstable. The same madness that made him unstoppable in war made him dangerous at home. In Icelandic law, berserkers were eventually outlawed. Killing one was not considered a crime, it was seen as necessary protection. And yet, kings and chieftains continued to use them. In battle they were the god's fury. In peacetime they were a ticking bomb. It's important to understand that for the Vikings, magic and war were not separate. The boundary between spiritual and physical power was thin. A sword was just as powerful as a spell. A warrior's strength came not only from training but from what he believed flowed through him. The berserker wasn't born strong. He was made powerful by ritual, by sacrifice, by madness. And perhaps by mushrooms. Modern science still debates whether fly agaric or henbane could truly produce the legendary berserker state. Some say the symptoms align too well to be coincidence. Others argue that while hallucinations and aggression are possible, they would more likely impair a warrior than empower him. But the answer might lie not in chemistry but in belief. A warrior believed that eating a mushroom made him invincible, if his community treated him as a vessel of divine rage, and if his enemies feared him as a demon, then perhaps he didn't need the drugs to actually work. Perhaps the power was psychological. A kind of placebo possession. Even today we see echoes of this. Soldiers in modern warfare are often given stimulants before combat. Amphetamines, energy pills, adrenaline boosters. The goal is the same. Eliminate fear, heighten focus, and blur the line between humanity and machine. The berserker, in that sense, was a prototype of a very modern idea, the altered warrior. But unlike today's soldiers, berserkers weren't controlled by orders or strategy. They were unleashed. Like wolves, like fire. And sometimes that fire burned everything, including their own side. The cost of harnessing such power was always high. But in a world where honor was found in death and glory was measured in blood, that price was worth paying. As we journey deeper into the Berserker mythos, we will soon explore the rituals that surrounded these warriors. How were they chosen? Who led the ceremonies? And what role did Norse magic play in maintaining the Berserker state? We'll also look at the women behind the madness, the Valvas and witches who whispered to the dead, and perhaps whispered into the minds of Berserkers as well. But for now, one truth remains: whether by mushroom, madness, or magic, the Berserkers of Viking lore were unlike any warriors history has ever known. And whatever they consumed, believed, or became, it worked. Because more than 1,000 years later, we're still afraid of them. The transformation of an ordinary Viking into a Berserker was not an accident of fate. It was a path deliberately chosen, carved through ritual, hardship, and a deep surrender to something primal. These men weren't simply warriors, they were vessels of divine fury. Becoming a Berserker meant more than learning to fight. It meant abandoning the self, shattering the boundary between man and monster. And it began long before the battlefield. From the outside, the Berserker looked like a lunatic, a frothing, howling savage charging with no armor, sometimes even naked, wielding axes with abandon. But this chaos had discipline behind it. Hidden beneath the frenzied surface was a long tradition of induction and initiation, passed down not through written texts, but through trial, blood, and secrecy. Some were born into it, raised in families that worshipped Odin's darker aspects. Others were selected, perhaps because of their violence, their visions, or their ability to endure pain. But once chosen, there was no turning back. The first step was isolation. A prospective Berserker would often retreat from his community, either alone or under the guidance of a mentor. He would fast sometimes for days. He would sleep outside, exposed to cold, wind, and animals. This was a deliberate act of unmaking, peeling away civilization and comfort, breaking the ego down to its bones. At night, the would-be Berserker might chant, whisper prayers to Odin, or even engage in acts of self-harm, ritual bleeding to thin the veil between life and death. He was preparing himself not to kill, but to die. To be reborn as something new. Pain was a teacher. Hunger was a test. And when the hallucinations came, whether from starvation, mushrooms, or divine madness, they were welcomed, not feared. The initiate would see visions, of wolves in the woods, of bears in the mist, of great ravens with glowing eyes. These weren't mere dreams. They were signs. The animal spirits were watching. And when the spirit chose him, he would know. He would feel it crawling inside, claws beneath the skin, fur growing behind his eyes. Once the initiate had endured his isolation, he would return to the tribe, not as a man but as a vessel. That's when the real ritual began. The initiation ceremony of the Berserkers is lost to time, but we can reconstruct fragments from sagas, archaeology, and comparative ritual traditions. There may have been blood offerings, animal or human, spilled to sanctify the transformation. The young Berserker might be made to stand within a circle of fire, chanting the names of animals or gods. The Valvas, Norse seeresses, may have been present, whispering incantations calling upon the spirits to enter the body. He may have been made to fight, blindfolded, against older warriors. Every blow, every scar was part of the trial. Pain wasn't avoided, it was the key. And when the time was right, he would don the animal skin. Berserkers weren't named randomly. The word comes from Old Norse, berserker, which may mean bear shirt or bear shirt. Some scholars argue that the Berserker wore the pelt of a bear, symbolizing his possession by its spirit. Others believe he went into battle shirtless, unarmored, demonstrating his invincibility. But in either case, the symbolism was the same. He was no longer a man. He was a beast. Wolves too played a role. Another class of warrior known as the Ulfanar, wolfcoats, fought in packs, howling and leaping with terrifying precision. These men wore wolf pelts, fought in tightly bonded units, and may have represented Odin's own wolf warriors. They were berserkers in a different skin, less chaotic but no less terrifying. The animal wasn't just a costume. It was a psychological transformation. Wearing the pelt, taking on the name, howling the sounds of the beast, it all fed into a complete identity shift. The man no longer thought like a man. He thought like the animal, fought like the animal, killed like the animal. And perhaps the most terrifying part, he enjoyed it. The battle trance, known in Norse as Berserksganger, wasn't just rage. It was a deep, altered state in which fear, doubt, and morality disappeared. Time slowed. Pain dulled. The Berserker felt no wounds. His heartbeat thundered. His muscles surged. Some accounts describe them biting their shields, foaming at the mouth, or gnawing their own flesh. Others tell of warriors shrugging off spears as if they were twigs, laughing with bloodied teeth as they tore through enemy lines. These weren't metaphors. They were testimonies from those who witnessed the horror firsthand. But there was a darker side to this transformation. When the frenzy ended, it didn't simply disappear. It left the berserker drained, haunted, or broken. Some collapsed into seizures. Others cried like children. A few became violent again, unable to tell the difference between friend and foe. In one saga, a berserker accidentally kills his own kin during a post-battle frenzy. Another speaks of a man so lost in madness that he is chained like a dog between battles. The beast, once summoned, could not always be put back in the cage. This is what made the berserkers both powerful and dangerous. They were weapons, but unstable ones. That's why they were often kept apart from the rest of the army, called upon only when the tide turned. They weren't commanders. They were chaos. Despite this, they held a sacred place in Viking society. Some leaders kept berserkers as. Others placed them at the center of battle formations, using their sheer terror to break enemy morale. There were even elite berserker brotherhoods, warrior cults bound not by blood but by madness. These groups may have lived separately, performed secret rites, and trained their minds and bodies to maintain the berserker state longer than ordinary men. They weren't just madmen. They were practitioners of a very dark art. And behind all of it stood Odin. Odin was not the kindly all-father of modern Norse pop culture. He was a war god, a god of madness, shape-shifting, and sacrifice. He hung himself from the world tree to gain knowledge. He plucked out his own eye. He demanded blood. And it was to him that the berserkers prayed. They didn't fight for glory or treasure. They fought for the god who whispered through the wind, who sent ravens to feed on the dead, who demanded that they become more than human. Odin didn't want warriors. He wanted monsters. But monsters don't live long. The berserkers' end often came not from enemy swords but from their own people. As Viking society grew more organized, more Christianized, more settled, there was less room for chaos. Berserkers were banned in many regions. Their legal protections were stripped. In Iceland, a man who went berserk was no longer honored. He was hunted. Yet still the image endured. The bear warrior. The wolf man. The howling demon at the edge of the firelight. Today we might compare them to elite military units or cultists. But no modern force replicates what the berserkers truly were. They weren't fighting for country. They weren't even fighting for survival. They were trying to become gods, or at least die as one. In the end, that's the core of the berserker myth. Not just rage, not just drugs, but transformation. A surrender so complete, so violent, that it tore away the human and revealed the beast beneath. And in the eyes of the Norse, that was not a fall, it was ascension. In the heart of the Viking wilderness, far from the mead halls and longships, a different kind of war was waged, a war of spirit and soul. Before a berserker could unleash his fury on the battlefield, he had to pass through fire. Not literal flames, perhaps, but rituals so intense, so visceral, they scorched the human out of him. These were not casual ceremonies. They were acts of sacrifice, crafted to tear the mind open and invite something ancient inside. Fire and blood were the tools. Madness was the gateway. Long before the clash of steel, Viking warriors gathered in secrecy, cloaked in night and shadow. The air was thick with smoke, resin, herbs, and burning wood. Drums beat slowly at first, echoing the heartbeat of the earth itself. Then faster, harder, until the rhythm pulsed inside their skulls. This was not entertainment. It was preparation. The berserker did not simply take a potion and charge into battle. He had to become something else, and that transformation required pain, pressure, and ritual precision. At the center of it all stood the fire. Flames licked the sky, casting long shadows that danced like spirits. Around it, the berserkers formed a circle, often bare-chested or completely naked, covered in ash or smeared with blood. Some cut symbols into their own skin, runes of protection, rage, or offering. Others drank from ceremonial horns filled not just with mead, but with potent infusions, hallucinogenic mushrooms, fermented herbs, sometimes even animal blood. It wasn't the drink that transformed them, it was what came after. As the chemicals took hold and the drumbeats intensified, the berserker entered a trance. Not the peaceful meditation of monks, but a storm of visions. Eyes rolled back, muscles twitched, bodies convulsed. Some fell to their knees, weeping or laughing uncontrollably. Others howled like wolves or roared like bears. They were not pretending. They were crossing a threshold. In this state, time shattered. Self dissolved. The line between man and beast blurred. It wasn't random. It followed a pattern, ritualized, choreographed in its chaos. An elder berserker, perhaps the last one still lucid, guided the process. He whispered chants in Old Norse, invoked the names of gods long dead. Odin, of course, but also Fenrir the wolf, and the dragon Nidhogg who gnaws at the roots of the world. The berserker's body was becoming a battlefield for these powers, a vessel for divine fury. And the final offering was always blood. Blood was central to Norse ritual, not symbolic but real. Animals were sacrificed, their entrails read like ancient scrolls. Blood was poured into the earth, smeared on faces or flung into the fire. In some accounts, berserkers even tasted human blood during rituals, believing it bound them more closely to death and destiny. The goal wasn't horror. It was communion. By touching death they believed they became immune to it. This was the berserker's rebirth. Through this ritual frenzy he was no longer himself. He was something greater, and far more dangerous. But it wasn't only the men who channeled this darkness. There are hints, rare, veiled, of women participating in similar rites. Shield maidens perhaps. Or even the Volvas, the sorceresses of Norse legend. They too worked with blood and fire. But instead of frenzy they sought vision. While the berserker charged into war, the Volva knelt in the smoke, whispering to the dead. Both were seeking power. Both were shedding their humanity. The location of these rituals mattered. Sacred groves, hidden caves, ancient burial mounds. Nature wasn't just a backdrop, it was a participant. The earth drank the blood. The wind carried the chants. Some rites were performed atop cliffs or beside waterfalls, places believed to be close to the spirit world. These weren't temples of stone. They were temples of bone, moss, and fire. And within these wild sanctuaries, symbols ruled. Runes were carved into stone, painted on skin, or burned into wood. Each one carried intent: destruction, protection, transformation. The most feared symbol was Tyr rune, representing the god of war, often invoked in moments of sacrifice. Another was Algi's, the elk rune, a sign of divine protection. These weren't decorative, they were magical contracts. Words that bound the warrior to the gods. Ritual objects surrounded the berserker. Ceremonial axes, carved bones, animal skulls, feathers, cloaks stitched from wolf fur. Each item held meaning. Some were talismans, others were offerings. Occasionally warriors would don masks, wooden, grotesque, with exaggerated animal features. It wasn't disguise. It was embodiment. The man disappeared. The beast remained. And yet, despite the savagery, there was order. The rituals followed cycles, mirroring the seasons, the phases of the moon, or the stages of life and death. Some berserker cults trained for months before undergoing their first rite. They fasted, fought, endured pain. Only when they proved themselves worthy were they allowed into the circle. This was initiation, yes, but also protection. A berserker who failed the ritual could go mad permanently. The rite had to be precise, controlled, guided. Because failure wasn't just a personal loss, it was a spiritual catastrophe. The berserker who fell into madness without the god's blessing could become cursed. In some sagas, these failed warriors are described as wandering, foaming beasts, abandoned by their kin. Not honored, not feared, just pity. Rituals were dangerous but necessary. Without them, the berserker was just a madman. With them, he was a weapon of the gods. There are archaeological echoes of these practices. Burial sites have yielded strange items. Hallucinogenic plant residues, bones with carved runes, weapons laid beside ritual cups. One grave in Norway revealed a warrior buried with bear claws and mushrooms in a leather pouch. Another held a man whose skull had been trepanned, drilled deliberately, perhaps to relieve spiritual pressure or induce visions. These weren't random. They were ritual traces, ghosts of ceremonies long forgotten. The Christian chroniclers who later encountered these practices were horrified. To them this was devil worship, blasphemy, lunacy. But to the Vikings it was sacred. It was how they became what the world feared. And there was one final, secret rite. Before the battle, at the edge of dawn, the berserker would often perform a solitary act, a personal offering. He might slice his own palm and smear it across his face. He might whisper a final vow to Odin, swearing to kill without mercy. Some bit their tongues until blood dripped from their lips, a silent promise that they would not speak again until they tasted enemy flesh. These acts were quiet, private, but they sealed the transformation. The fire burned low. The blood had been spilled. The drums faded. Then came silence. And in that silence, the berserker stood, changed, possessed, ready. When he walked to battle, he did not walk like a man. He moved like something ancient, something summoned. His eyes did not blink. His breath came in bursts. And when the horn blew, he didn't hesitate. He ran, screaming, into the chaos, because he had already died in the ritual. The battlefield was merely the second death. That's what made the Berserker unstoppable. He wasn't afraid of pain. He had already lived through it. He didn't fear death. He had already met it face to face in the fire and the blood. The Berserker was not a man. He was a myth in motion, a ritual given flesh. And though the world has changed, the memory of those nights, lit by fire, soaked in blood, still lingers. In the stories, in the bones, in the fear that maybe, just maybe, something of the beast still sleeps within us all. In the pantheon of Norse mythology, no figure was more complex, contradictory, and terrifyingly brilliant than Odin. He was a god of war, but also wisdom. A god of death, but also poetry. A seeker of truth who willingly embraced madness to uncover secrets no other dared touch. And it was through this madness, this reckless unraveling of sanity, that Odin unlocked the core of Berserker magic. To understand the Berserkers is to understand the mind of the mad god who created them. Odin did not sit on a golden throne dispensing justice. He wandered, disguised, alone. He bled for wisdom, hung himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 long nights, not to die but to gain the runes. He plucked out one of his own eyes and cast it into Mimir's well to drink its knowledge. Who does this? Only a god who views pain as a currency. A god who knows that the deepest truths are locked behind the walls of fear, agony, and altered consciousness. Odin was not just a war god, he was the first to go berserk. Not in body, in soul. His madness was chosen. His insanity was a gateway. He ripped open his own mind so he could see beyond the veil of reality. It wasn't bravery. It was obsession. The kind of unflinching devotion that makes men into monsters, or gods. And this divine descent into madness became the blueprint for the Berserker trance. Odin's methods weren't metaphor, they were rituals passed on to mortals. He taught magic to women. He whispered forbidden knowledge to Volvas. But to the Berserkers he offered something darker, a fragment of his own chaos. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, flew across the world gathering truths. But in battle, Odin didn't need thought. He needed fury. He needed that blind, roaring force that ignored wounds, forgot pain, and consumed enemies like wildfire. This was not calculated strategy. This was primal. It was divine insanity weaponized. And yet, Odin was not feared because he raged, he was feared because he saw what others could not. He communed with the dead, spoke in riddles, made war through dreams. The Berserker rituals were his reflection in the mortal realm. Those who consumed hallucinogens and fell into seizures were not simply trying to lose themselves. They were trying to become him. They were offering their minds as altars to his storm. There are stories, ancient, broken, of warriors who claimed Odin entered them in battle. Not as a blessing, as a possession. They described their minds going dark, their limbs moving without command, their mouths speaking in voices not their own. These weren't lies. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a system built to shatter the ego and rebuild it in Odin's image. A system where madness was clarity. To understand just how deeply Odin influenced the Berserker path, one must look at the Galdr, chants and spells sung by warriors before battle. These were not just motivational songs. They were keys to altered states. Recited in rhythmic cadence, often for hours, these chants tuned the mind into a different frequency. Warriors sang until their tongues went numb, until language collapsed, until they could no longer remember their own names. This was the point. To forget who you were so something else could enter. The god who received those chants was Odin. Not Thor. Not Freyr. Only he demanded such sacrifice of the mind. Only he understood that the battlefield required not just strength but insanity. The kind of insanity that could make a man laugh as arrows pierced his chest. The kind that could silence doubt and override fear. Odin's teachings were cruel but effective. His connection to the dead was another thread in this dark tapestry. Odin ruled Valhalla, where fallen warriors trained for the final war, Ragnarok. But he also walked among the dead, spoke to their spirits, demanded knowledge from corpses. He wasn't content with life. He wanted dominion over what lay beyond it. Berserkers, too, often flirted with death, not just on the battlefield but in their rituals. Some would lie in graves overnight. Others smeared themselves with grave dust or wore bones. These were not macabre games. They were imitations, reflections, homages to Odin who walked between worlds. It said that Odin could make a coward brave, or a sane man mad, with a whisper. His madness was not a sickness. It was a gift. A dangerous, volatile gift that burned away everything but purpose. That's what the Berserkers craved. Not just strength but that singular focus. That divine obsession. And Odin's animals were no coincidence. The bear, the wolf, the eagle. Each one a predator, sacred to him in different rites. The Berserker did not pick these forms randomly. They were channels, avatars. To wear a bear pelt was to say, I am the fist of Odin. To howl like a wolf was to summon his storm. These identities weren't roleplay. They were reincarnation in the moment of battle. Odin didn't need armies, he needed mirrors. And the Berserkers became just that. But there was always a cost. Madness, once tasted, doesn't leave easily. Many Berserkers never fully returned from their trances. They became shadows of themselves. Paranoia haunted them. Rage flickered at the edges of every conversation. Some became wanderers. Others were killed by their own kin. Even the Norse sagas whisper of this danger, that Odin's gifts were laced with poison. That the fire which lit your path could also burn your home. Odin himself was not immune. His wisdom brought despair. His knowledge showed him the end of all things, Ragnarok. The very future he tried to shape would ultimately consume him. And perhaps he knew that. Perhaps that's why he shared his madness with men. If he was doomed, he would not go alone. There's a terrible beauty in this. The idea that the greatest power lies not in control but surrender. Odin surrendered his eye, his body, his sanity. The Berserkers surrendered their humanity. And in that mutual sacrifice, they found a connection deeper than worship. They became pieces of a divine madness scattered across the battlefield. Even centuries later, when the old gods were buried beneath crosses and churches, Odin's echo lingered. In the nightmares of Christian monks. In the stories whispered by firesides. In the eyes of warriors who returned from war and could no longer speak of what they'd seen. They didn't know Odin's name, but they knew his shadow. Today we try to understand him with logic. We dissect the myths, the runes, the rituals. But maybe that's missing the point. Odin wasn't meant to be understood. He was meant to be experienced, in fear, in awe, in that wild pulse behind the eyes before the charge begins. He was the god of the unexplainable, the patron of the impossible. And through the Berserkers he became flesh. They didn't worship him with prayers. They worshipped him with blood, with screams, with minds torn open. Odin did not need altars. He needed battlefields. He needed those willing to walk the knife's edge of sanity and dive headfirst into the void. And the Berserkers did just that. In the end, the mind of a mad god was not a place of chaos, but of clarity born through fire. And those who dared enter it, who dared to become its living expression, forever changed the face of war, of faith, of fear. They weren't just men. They were echoes of Odin's madness, given breath. Long after the last Berserker screamed into a battlefield, after the last blood-soaked ritual vanished into the mists of time, the legends refused to die. Something about them lingered, not in bone or ash but in memory, in the terrified whispers of survivors, in the warnings of priests, and in the myths that outlived the men themselves. The Berserkers were gone, but the idea of them only grew more powerful. What began as flesh and ritual slowly became myth and fear, until even centuries later, their shadows still stalked the edges of history. Their transformation from real men into symbols of madness and power was not accidental. It was inevitable. Christianity swept across Scandinavia like a slow, cold tide. Churches replaced sacred groves, crosses rose where runestones once stood, and the old gods were driven underground, painted as demons or forgotten entirely. But the Berserkers posed a unique problem. They were too wild, too untamed to convert, too unpredictable to be tolerated. To the new order, these warriors weren't just pagans, they were monsters. And so the process of erasure began. Berserkers were outlawed, their practices condemned as sorcery or demonic possession. Legal codes from medieval Iceland explicitly banned Berserker behavior, labeling it dangerous and unholy. What had once been admired became cursed. The war cries that once stirred courage were now rebranded as howls of madness. And yet, even as the church tried to scrub them from the world, the stories endured. In secret and silence, they were told again and again, of warriors who could not be killed, who bit their shields and roared like beasts, who fought until the ground itself drank their fury. These weren't fairy tales. They were memories clinging to life. They evolved in the telling, twisted by fear and reverence. Berserkers became symbols of unstoppable rage, divine fury, the raw edge of human potential, and danger. They were no longer just men who fought differently, they became the very embodiment of violence unchained. And in that transformation they entered the realm of myth. Even the language bore the scars of their legend. The term berserk survived, severed from its roots but still potent. Today to go berserk means to lose control, to unleash a primal rage, and few know that buried within that word is a history soaked in blood and hallucination. The modern world speaks their name without knowing it, without understanding the price paid to make that word what it is. This is the nature of myth. It forgets the details but never the feeling. The berserkers may have vanished, but their energy survived. Archaeologists still uncover hints, bones bent in strange ways, grave goods suggesting ritual or status, ancient teeth worn down by shield biting. These are fragments of a puzzle no one can fully solve. But the bigger truth lies not in artifacts but in atmosphere. The cold dread that creeps into a tale when the berserker appears, the awe felt by enemies and allies alike, the way their presence warps reality. These were not ordinary warriors. They were something else. Something the world still doesn't quite know how to categorize. Over time, folklore began to reshape them. In some tales they became shapeshifters. Men who turned into wolves or bears, not just in spirit but in body. In others they were cursed, bound to rage, unable to rest even in death. Some stories told of their ghosts wandering the forests, howling in eternal fury, still searching for battle. These were exaggerations perhaps, but they revealed a deeper truth. The world could not let them go. Even as it feared them, it needed them, as symbols, as warnings, as legends to haunt the darkness. The berserker became a metaphor not just for battle but for the chaos within all men. The part of the soul that longs to break free, to reject order, to abandon control and drown in instinct. They represented what civilization tried to bury, that beneath every king and farmer and priest, there is still a beast with a hunger for violence. And for a time the berserkers were the ones who let that beast loose, legally, even honorably. They lived a truth that others denied. And when that truth became too dangerous, it was buried in story. But not all stories vilified them. Some remembered them as heroes, brave warriors who died without fear, whose loyalty to their gods and clans was absolute. These accounts did not focus on their rage but their sacrifice, their willingness to lose themselves for a cause. Even the darkest rituals had a purpose. The madness they embraced was not for pleasure but transformation. They became tools of divine will even if it shattered them. In this way the berserker was not a villain, but a martyr, burned alive by the fire he chose to carry. Modern media resurrected them once again. Films, video games, and novels draw upon the berserker myth constantly. But they often miss the core, focusing on the violence, the spectacle, while ignoring the ritual, the spiritual terror, the mind-breaking commitment it required. The true berserker experience was not cool. It was horrifying. To strip away identity, to dance at the edge of life and death, to surrender to something older and darker than language, it demanded more than muscle. It demanded soul. And that's what still makes the legend powerful today. In a world addicted to control and logic, the berserker reminds us of what lies beyond. The possibility that we are not as civilized as we pretend. That under the suits and cities and screens, the old fire still burns. That if pushed far enough, by trauma, by war, by faith, we could awaken that sleeping part of ourselves. The part that does not fear pain. That part that howls. But no myth survives unchanged. Christianity, nationalism, and romanticism each took their turn reshaping the berserker image to suit their own ends. In some periods they were seen as holy warriors, blessed with divine fury. In others they were painted as satanic, wild-eyed heathens who needed to be exorcised. But all these versions share one thing, the sense that the berserker was other. Not entirely human. Something in between beast and god. And perhaps that is why they continue to fascinate us. Because the berserker lives in contradiction. Sacred and savage. Worshipped and outlawed. Hero and horror. They are a mirror held to the face of mankind, showing us what we look like without rules, without masks, without shame. And for many that image is too disturbing to face directly. So we hide it in story. In fantasy. In the safe cages of fiction. But it's still there, pacing in the dark. The berserker's fall was not just a cultural shift. It was a warning. That some kinds of power are too dangerous to tolerate. That if you let men become monsters even for noble reasons they might forget how to return. That the gods who teach madness rarely offer a path back. Odin gave his berserkers strength, but not peace. And those who danced in his shadow often died alone, misunderstood, feared even by those they fought for. Still, their myth survives. In every tale of the unkillable warrior. In every scream that turns a tide. In every moment when fear becomes fury, and the rational mind shuts down to let something older take over. The Berserker never truly left. They simply changed form. From warriors to words. From flesh to myth. And myths, unlike men, do not die.